Good.
Hello, Rozalyn, and thank you very,
hmm
very, very much for joining us on Longevity Dialogues. We we absolutely have longevity royalty with us today.
We've no monarchy in Ireland, by the way.
Not at the moment,
Unless you're
but
thinking of ancient kings.
it seems to be getting very popular worldwide. So we might relook at it.
Gosh, yeah.
Uh, um, but no, it's amazing to have you on, and your background is fascinating. But I would like, if you don't mind, to give us the background. Um, and I know it's a cliche question, but at what age and at what point did your interests point you in this direction? Was it something in
Yeah.
school? Were there subjects you were good at? I'd love people, young people to kind of relate to this
Yeah.
journey as well.
Sure. Yeah. No. I was always interested in science, and I was very lucky. I went to school in Dalkey, Loretto Abbey, and at the time it wasn't possible to do chemistry, physics, and biology together because they were clashing on the calendar. And the amazing head of the school, Sister Camilla, changed the calendar so that I could do it. So that
Ha!
was just really, yeah, it was really just brilliant. And then I was able to take extra classes outside of the school as well. But I'd always been interested in science. And I wasn't clear initially if I'd prefer to go more of a physics kind of route versus like biology route. But I did my undergraduate in Trinity. And when I was there, it was pretty clear to me I was just loved the biochemistry. That was my favorite. And at that time, I wasn't thinking about being in aging at all. It wasn't even on the radar remotely. I did my PhD in UCD with Geraldine Butler, and we worked in the yeast model. And that was super cool. And she'd spent time in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so this idea of maybe going to the US to study, that's probably the first seed. So thank you, Geraldine. And so when I moved from PhD to postdoc, at that time, I was by then with my husband, who I'd met at a scientific conference, if you can imagine, and we had a daughter. And so we moved to the US. He's American. And so I was in Boston for a while, still working in yeast, but now in aging. So that was where the first exposure to aging really came in. And if you can imagine trying to study aging in a unicellular organism, you actually can. And it's actually really informative. And a lot of what we know about cell biology comes from the study of yeast. So I was there for a while, and then I was looking to do another postdoc, and I realized that, you know what, this caloric restriction thing is pretty cool. It's a metabolic basis for changing how aging happens. And then I realized there was an investigator here in Madison, Wisconsin, who was doing caloric restriction in mice. I was like, hell, I'm going to have a piece of that. So we moved to Madison. And as it turned out, my husband got a position here as well. We were all fine, postdocs, not a penny to our name, two small children. And in the course of that, I found out they had a study in monkeys on caloric restriction. So I did two postdocs and then a scientist position with the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. I became involved in that monkey study. And
Amazing.
so, well, that was, I was pretty much locked and loaded at that point
Can I
because of
go
the
back?
biology.
Amazing. Can I go back a small bit then on
Mm.
when you were in Boston and you were working on the yeast? Just for the way
Yeah.
to
So
kind of looking at our
how,
audience here is we will have
yeah.
people
So
who know very little about anything, and I'm a really good representation of that.
I'm casting my mind back. So in yeast, they're unicells. So you think of them as, small cows rather than large bacteria. And they're eukaryotic, and they have all of these properties of cell biology that we know for sure really were identified first in yeast. And so you can do two different types of measuring aging. You can look at cell division, so mitotic aging, or you can look at what we call chronological aging, is how long you remain alive and you're still fit. So one is more like a post-mitotic, like differentiated cells, cells that are not dividing, and one is more relative to the dividing cells. As part of that, we got interested in caloric restriction, and this is working with David Sinclair, that I think some people will know.
Yeah.
He's very famous in the aging field, and we became interested in caloric restriction there, and identified a couple of metabolic pathways that were instrumental in conferring that delayed aging and improved survival in the yeast. And so you can do caloric restriction and make the cells live longer in stasis, or you can do the caloric restriction and they'll divide more times than the cells that are on a normal diet.
So
And
if
so when
we
you move to the mice, you can see the same thing. The parallels are there.
Super. So if we see just again for people to get a kind of a grasp
Mm.
broadly in the field, the this might be an oversimplistic. Well, I'm sure it's an oversimplistic version of it, but is it wrong to say that the caloric restriction impact on aging is discovered back in the 30s. But then
Oh,
it's
yeah.
in the 1990s when we get some genetic interventions that show that
You're absolutely right, Martin. You're absolutely right. So
other
it's
than
kind of,
starving yourself, yeah.
yeah. And well, first of all, not starving. So it's
Yeah.
lower food intake without malnutrition. But yes, it was largely, I think at the early stages, phenomenology. And one of the earliest kind of viewing the physiology and, potential mechanisms really focused on immunity and the immune system and inflammation. So that was Roy Walford, who really was one of the champions of this field altogether. The guy I worked with, and a very good friend, Rick Weindruck, wrote the book on delayed aging in the 80s. And so when I realized I had the opportunity to come and work for him, of course, I jumped at it. And he was involved in looking at mouse models and rat models of delayed aging. So when the animals eat less, they live longer. They eat less, they weigh less, they're smaller, and they live longer. And they offset the timing of age-related diseases. But get this, Martin, in the 90s, there were papers showing that caloric restriction delayed the onset of cancer. And not just cancers that spontaneously arise, but also ones that are implanted or ones that are induced by toxic agents to induce cancers. So there's something about caloric restriction, which is like non-permissive for tumor growth. It's super fascinating. There have been attempts over the years, they've stalled, to bring cancer and aging more closely together. And I'm about to digress now, if you don't mind. It's the
Oh,
principle
please
of
do.
geroscience. So this idea, you've got all these age-related diseases, cancer, diabetes, and I don't want this to sound so grim. I mean, there are beautiful things about aging, but we focus on that biology of age-related disease vulnerability, neurodegeneration, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all of an aging component. So there's something that happens with aging that now you become vulnerable to this sort of thing, whereas in youth you were not. And so the principle of geroscience is that if we could understand the aging contribution to those diseases, we'd have a much better window on how they're happening and why they're happening, and we could devise better ways to treat them. So historically, each of these, so I'm based in the US, obviously all my references will be Americanized, so apologies for that. But the National Institutes of Health has a number of different institutes, all designated for particular diseases, many of which have an aging component. So the geroscience principle was really to try and encourage investigators studying diseases of aging to actually use aging models, to superimpose aging on their genetic models. Because without that aging environment, you're kind of missing what's going on in the spontaneous disease that happens in age for all mammals. There are like conditions of age in other species, but those diseases of aging, mammalian diseases of aging, the biology is so conserved,
Yeah. And tell me, you said that there's beautiful things about aging.
Mm.
We're talking about the accumulation of wisdom and experience there as opposed to the degenerative
Yeah.
process, I'm
And
guessing.
let's not forget style, sophistication,
Well,
and a sense of humor.
two of us clearly have all of that in abundance. So, but the thesis that, well, for you actually, I
Mm.
this is kind of getting into difficult territory as well. But if you were asked to define aging in a simple
Mm.
term or explain aging in a
Yeah.
simple term, and what brought me to that was just the idea that diseases and aging aren't separated, or these chronic diseases are more a manifestation of the degenerative process. And
Yeah.
so you're tackling both things, or you're trying to arrest diseases by trying to delay or arrest the degenerative process associated with aging.
Yeah.
Does that fit, or are
Yeah.
they too?
No, you're absolutely right. And I can tell you that trying to get a consensus on what is aging is extremely difficult. And it depends. You're asking, a bench scientist, a physician, somebody who's working in policy, in hospital care, and I think some of the most vague versions are the best. So it's this gradual decline in the system, and then that precipitates age. And there's a lot of dialogue about, when we're studying aging, are we just studying diseases of aging, or are we studying aging itself? And I think that it gets pretty difficult to tease those apart, particularly with advancing age, when people can often have not just one, but multiple morbidities, comorbidities. And so when you go to the human population, there are a lot of these different factors that are brought to bear and make it difficult to pull out exactly what it is that's going wrong. There are key signatures that we know. So this gradual, immune system senescence, and I mean that in the sense of getting older. We see changes in the composition of the immune cell types in circulation, differences in their activatability, differences in their ability to resolve after being engaged to fight an infection, for example, and we see inflammation. And so that's like this low sterile. It's not induced by a disease, but possibly due to things that are going slightly wrong, not broken, but slightly altered as a function of age. And that gives rise to that inflammatory tone. It's called inflammaging. So, people are making up terms all the time, but inflammaging has stuck. And there's definitely that elevation in inflammatory tone. And that if it affects how people are going to respond to insults and injuries when they get older. Even the response to vaccines, for example, is different in older individuals than it is in the young.
Yeah. And if we just to kind of stay on that broad theory of aging, then, so I've seen it discussed, so many things go wrong. It's systemic, it's incredibly complicated. And that if you target a particular hallmark through a particular pathway, you couldn't really have any effect because, if a 95-year-old doesn't die of one thing, they're going to die of 6 other things that are lined up to kill them. So
I know it's just this, it's the sadness of being alive, but that should also be the joy of it too, right? We're
tell
only
me,
here for a little
why
bit.
does CR then affect? Because anything that affects lifespan would need to be having an impact on almost everything, right?
And I think that CR does that. And, without getting into the weeds, I think there's this interplay between growth, by which I mean growth signaling, and metabolism. And so what CR seems to do is just impose this very efficient metabolic stasis. There's no waste. Everything's used, everything's repaired. And I think that that's part of what's going on. There's also a depression of growth signaling. So these are things you may have heard of, like growth factor, insulin-like growth factor, the target of rapamycin, mTOR, these things that give cells the ability to grow or to do or to make. And those things are kind of dampened with CR because of the nutrient, let's call it, it's a restriction, not, a limitation. You're certainly not malnourished. So there's that interplay between the energetics and the currency to do things. And somehow, if you get to that sweet spot with caloric restriction, you can fine tune. And that seems to be how it's working in terms of delaying aging and also improving survival. So in our monkey study, we certainly saw that. We didn't have enough.
To cut across.
Go ahead.
Can you tell us, so I'm back, a young person in Dublin or in Loreto Dalkey, no less. And I'm studying science and I'm really interested in it. And I traveled this journey with you. When do I get to meet the monkeys?
Well, you'll have to pass on to the other realm because my monkeys, the study that I have, they're all deceased. And
well,
so
not specifically your monkeys, but what got you interested, or what got you in working with our nearest friends? Yeah.
Well, I had been working in mice for some time and, working in cultured cells. So, you can take different cell types out and you can grow them and you can ask, what does this do if I do this, but I don't do that? Does this change how this, looking at the fundamental biology? The mice are great. They've got a short lifespan, about 3 years. You get genetic, transgenic, not transgender, White House. You can get, different ways to manipulate them. There's some really sophisticated tools in mice now. It's just absolutely beautiful. But that short lifespan, they're like 85% homologous. They have, they eat at night. They reproduce very young in their life. And their metabolism runs high. They have a very high heartbeat. So there are parallels and their biology is absolutely valid and applicable. But when it comes to the longer term strategies for a longer lifespan, the non-human primates are better. So one of the things about the study that I particularly liked is that the only interventions were to cure what ails you. These animals they probably were in better health conditions than most people in the United States in terms of healthcare monitoring. They were monitored, daily. They had vet clinics weekly. They had some biometrics and samples analyzed every 6 months. And this went on for 30 years. So it's a very extensive, elaborate experiment. But what was so cool is that we were able to see that a lot of the things we knew in the short-lived species like mice and rats were absolutely recapitulated in the monkeys. And that becomes super interesting then, because when you start looking at things like brain of primates is quite different from the brain of rodents. And so we can now draw parallels between what we've seen in the monkeys and what happens in people. So we had, for example, we just submitting a study now where we've looked at the adipose tissue in the monkeys collected, post-mortem, and we look at their subcutaneous versus their visceral fat. We see what happens with age, we see what happens with caloric restriction, and then we can compare our monkeys to people on caloric restriction that were part of an NIH-sponsored clinical trial. And we can see parallels there in how the adipose tissue is responding. And that turns out to be important because, adipose is your friend. There's so much bad press for adiposity, but you need fat to have a proper functioning body. It's
Thank you
just when
very
the fat
much.
goes wrong.
I'm delighted to hear it.
Everything in biology, is good. It's just it can take a turn for the worst when things become a little bit.
Moderation. Yeah.
That's exactly. So yes, we see those parallels there, and we'd already seen at the systemic level, serum indices of health improvement in the humans that were absolutely in the.
There was a
Yeah,
human
yeah.
trial in calorie restriction. How was that?
There was, yeah. So it's called Caloric, and it's I don't know if you know this, but clinical researchers always come up with the darndest names for their studies, picking random letters out of word. This is not one of those. It's an actual acronym, and of course, in the name of God, I can't remember what it is, but it's CALERIE. And so to distinguish it from calorie, I always call it calorie. I don't think they like that.
Yeah.
So this is 2 years, 3 different locations across the US. And it was quite effective. Compliance wasn't as what they had hoped, but the biology was still there and primary outcomes were still delivered. So there's a new one happening now, which will be a 5-year intervention, and that's in the planning stages. I just heard about it. So that is people on
How do
CR.
they,
Yeah.
like that? Ethically, that's all fine for people to volunteer to go on calorie
Yeah, yeah,
restricted
oh yeah.
diets.
So these were, normal weight and maybe a little overweight people in their mid-50s, loosely. There were, of course, before the main calorie study, there were the earlier stages where they did shorter term interventions. And there they worked out all the bits and pieces. What are the measures they absolutely must have? What was compliance like? And they did a couple of slightly different approaches depending on the 3 sites. But that put them in really great shape to then launch the 2-year program. So it's
So
very
there's,
intensive.
but I wouldn't fancy volunteering for that particular trial. So there, although I should maybe, the idea that calorie restriction works on smaller creatures shorter lived creatures because it's to do with hunkering down for a famine period, and that it doesn't work then with longer lived species. If the monkey lives into their 20s, does that belie that a little bit?
Oh, it does. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things to, tease apart there. Hibernation research is super, super interesting. There's a complete change in metabolism that happens there. And there's this like pressing a pause button. In the short-lived species like worms and flies, they have actual pause abilities, but that's during development, not in adulthood. So what we were able to show with our monkey study is that the animals on CR had greater survival. We weren't powered. We didn't have enough animals to do a pure lifespan study. We'd need to have had a lot more, but we could, based on their survival data, like when they actually passed away, get estimated survival, statistically. And there's a pretty clear gap between the control-fed animals and the CR animals. But not only that, the onset of the first age-related morbidity had a pretty big gap too. So the promise of CR, I mean, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. I mean, just as you say, when people would think, oh, well, this only works in those short-lived species that are more, attuned to their environment or attuned to their nutritional status. Maybe they're hacking these pause buttons that they have. And some of those genes are actually recruited in regulating lifespan. But the fact that it worked in these animals, and this is the average lifespan for a rhesus monkey in captivity is 26 years. And the maximal lifespan was 40, but that record's been taken over by the study that was conducted at NIA, the National Institutes on Aging, a parallel monkey study. And they had several monkeys going past 40 years of age, which is just unheard of, absolutely unheard of.
That seems an enormous jump.
Yeah. And well, because, I think the monkey studies were really geared towards a proof of principle. So we have all their tissues now. We're doing all sorts of molecular profiling on those, and we can kind of drill down and see, well, what's different about how aging happens in these restricted animals. And I think that's the key. It's happening a bit differently. So things that decline in normal fed animals are maintained in the CR animals. We see differences in their serum profiles, difference in their tissue profiles. So the challenge now is meshing in all these molecular data with tissue physiology, systemic data, body weight, adiposity, that MRI, that sort of thing, and then how that feeds in to disease incidence. And so, I'll be doing that on Tuesday. No, it's obviously it's a huge project.
Could you solve aging entirely then maybe next week? If that's okay. And tell me the GLP-1 phenomenon of recent. Is that something to mention in this conversation, or is it
Well,
irrelevant?
I think it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, my favorite part of the GLP-1 story is that it started out, looking at these lizards in the desert that had an unusually stable GLP-1 and looking at, because it regulates insulin. It's a fantastic success story that was completely founded in basic biology. And that's it's just such a clear example. I keep seeing on my news feed, Ozempic, science got it wrong, but because it's behind some sort of Apple paywall, I'm not paying for it, so I'm waiting for it to become free.
So science
So I
got it
don't know.
right until
Yeah, and well, I mean, these types of articles, I haven't read it because I'm not paying for it, usually are hair splitting. And you always have, I don't know if you remember, there used to be this News of the World fake tabloid newspaper from the UK. And they
yeah.
really made a whole thing of having the headlines not matching the content.
Okay.
That was their thing.
Yeah.
So we see a lot of I don't know what they got wrong, how much of it was wrong, where it was wrong, who was wrong, but that's the kind of that's a clickbaity title.
I know
As
something
far
that
as I'm concerned, it's very expensive is one of the biggest problems. But if something is effective, there's enough market pressure to follow up those leads, and eventually, if things deliver on the promise, that will become available to more people. And I think one of the key pieces here is, I mean, I study aging, and when we look at we have our control animals, we avoid obesity, so that we're looking at aging specifically, not aging compromised by obesity related metabolic dysfunction. But the fact of the matter is that so many people are actually going into older age and they are overweight or obese. And for here in Wisconsin, 75% of the adult population is either overweight or obese. So we're really looking at aging in that context. On the clinical side, I mean, it has to be part of the discussion. So yeah, but I mean, a lot of the problems you see with metabolic dysfunction that's associated with obesity isn't in and of itself the problem. It's when it goes hand in hand with metabolic dysfunction that you have the problem. But a lot of those signatures that are increased in that disease vulnerable state are the things that CR decreases. So they
amazing.
seem to be like opposite sides of the same coin.
Yeah, so I'm getting that it's a bit of it's keeping yourself in pristine condition. It has kind of long-term benefits, which
Yeah.
is sort of obvious, I guess. But
Yeah,
did it rings across that kind of aging, almost entropic version of aging is really interesting, or how systemic.
it really is. Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
ask, Rosalind, any other areas within this field that are really kind of tickling your fancy outside of
Well, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So the part of the geroscience idea is finding things that can, target processes we know are important in aging. I think one of the biggest one to emerge recently are the this concept of senescent cells.
Mhm.
And so I'm teaching the med students at the moment, and I have a bunch of guest lecturers who come in, and it was just so funny. They all kind of coalesced around this senescence idea, and so these are cells that kind of exit stage left, except they don't exit. They stop dividing and they take on this very peculiar disposition that goes along with a very pro-inflammatory phenotype. It's called the senescence associated secretory phenotype, or SASP. And so I think in younger animals, I mean, those senescent cells are part of repair mechanisms. Somebody whacks you in the leg, you're going to have senescent cells there as part of the repair. There is a problem, let us fix it. But then they usually go away. And what seems to happen with age is that they're not being taken out as quickly as they need to be. And so they can influence tissues where they are. there's more of them in the context of obesity than there are, than in person with, a healthy BMI. So what they do is create that inflammatory type of setting. And so there's real interest in what are called senolytics, which go in and take out those senescent cells because they're resistant to being taken out. For some reason, they're just belligerent. Maybe they're Irish. I don't know. They refuse. They refuse to be taken out. So these senolytics are
They
drugs that try
migrate a
to
lot.
take.
If they're Irish,
well,
then they
well,
may
that would be
migrate.
the kicker. Yeah. I'm not sure about migration. But they have, so you can have senolytics that will try and take out those senescent cells, or xenomorphics that will just try to turn down that pro-inflammatory aspect of them. So I think that's been showing a lot of promise. And people will have heard of, these regenerative ideas. So the idea of, harnessing stem cells to repair and replenish older tissue. So that's very exciting. I mean, there always the concern is you put in, cells that have this pluripotent or just reprogrammed and pop them in to do repair, but you're never sure that that's the only thing they're going to do. Nothing in biology does only one thing. And so we know that cells act as communities and their behavior changes depending on where you pop them. And we know this from things like, bone marrow transplants, or even ovarian transplants, or if you take visceral fat and transplant it from one animal to the next. So it's the kind of crosstalk between what that cell is doing and where it is. And I think that's the beauty of it. I mean, the biology is super cool. So the senolytics, I think, are pretty hot. The therapies that are really in their infancy, geared towards rejuvenating cells so that you would have better maintenance and repair, is very exciting too. So, these are very specific and really high tech. So I think time will tell. And there's a lot of
Amazing.
interest in those.
Okay, so by the way, we're delighted that we'll have you in Dublin in a couple of months' time.
I know. I'm so thrilled.
Yeah, it's great. And get you back into Trinity as well.
Well, yeah, that would be such a laugh. I mean, I did give a talk in Trinity during COVID, but it was virtual. And I had hoped to actually go. I mean, I haven't really been there in so long, except for,
We're trying
cutting
to
across what I'm.
we're trying to get you back to Ireland, but it's
Yeah.
difficult to
Obviously,
find
I think it's
the
going to
right
be
kind of
fun.
monkeys.
Well, no, and I think that's, one of the things. If there were any way I could contribute to boosting biology of aging research in Ireland, that would be what I'd love to do. So I was Googling around, and of course, I mean, I know from the literature and from being involved in journals and everything, there are a couple of really great initiatives in Ireland. The Tilda study is outstanding, and that's a cooperative, I think, TCD and James's. And, there are aging centres in Limerick and in Cork. There's a and there and I think there's another in Belfast. So there's interest. The strengths tend to be on the more clinical side and community, like what we would call dissemination and implementation science. And that's about, it's all very well having an idea stuffed in there in your office, but what damn good is it if you can't implement it in the community? So that's an important and fairly new science discipline, but it's absolutely vital, getting the ideas, the concepts, and then getting them in a practical way. So it's like this difference between what's called efficacy and effectiveness. So can you actually implement it? So the clinical side and policy side, very strong in Ireland. The Tilda study really is outstanding. It's world class. But on the biology side, of course, I was firewalled out. I couldn't get into any of the university pages beyond the most superficial. So I don't know what's going on, but I'd be eager to participate if people wanted to, get engaged in biology of aging research. I think it would be pretty cool.
Well, they can, without being, really cheap about this, they can certainly meet you at the summit in Dublin, Longevity Summit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll kind of hopefully have some good networking opportunities, and people can come together and leverage the good research that goes on here, as you say, more into this field, because it's, it may have been more niche some years ago, some decades ago, but it's sort of becoming like an industry converging in and around the concept of staying well as long as possible, which is
absolutely. And there's a lot of interest on the financial side in aging, and for good reason. I mean, people are getting older and they want to get older in a comfortable, healthy way. And so one of my friends, I think Brian Kennedy, he's based in Singapore, but he makes this joke that billionaires are the new model of aging. It's funny, but it's true, because there are these clinics that are super comprehensive. and they'll measure all sorts of things at frequencies. So you get your own personal longitudinal measures. And I think that's one of those things where, most of the time, we're dealing with demographics from the population at large. So there are families with high blood pressure. You go in, you're told you have high blood pressure, but actually you are not having high blood pressure. The importance is measuring you over time. It's just an example. Not to say anyone with high blood pressure should just blame their genetics and not get it seen to. But those longitudinal measures are critical to see what's changing. So instead of, a lot of the population studies are based on what's cross-sectional. So 15 people of this age, 15 people of that age, or if you're in China, 1 million people of this age, 1 million people of that age. But because they're cross-sectional and not longitudinal, it's difficult to personalize. So that's where I think the investment in those clinics will pay dividends down the line for the public at large, because they are investing.
It's
Well,
funny,
no, it's not free.
it really
It's very
sounds like
expensive.
it really sounds like we teed this up, but I work with Brian in a company. You honestly,
Okay.
you did not know this, and it's
No, I didn't.
for clinics and other
Yeah.
healthcare providers to have that follow-on patient and have it very aging focused
It's
as well. So,
vital. It's
yeah,
absolutely vital. So,
and I think
going back to my monkeys super quick, we
yeah,
just had an analysis done for, metabolites and lipidome, and we're getting the proteome done now with this new amazing nanoball technology. It's really, really cool from the Sierra Bio, but we have the longitudinal specimens. So 30 years of study. So from adulthood until final demise, we can track all of these metabolites. And so you can, and all the animals, because they're non-human primates, they're genetically heterogeneous. And so each one is their own little microcosm, but they all serve as their own baseline. And it's extremely powerful.
that's fascinating. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna get, because we're coming up on time, I'm gonna give you
Yeah.
the last question that I tried to give. I don't know whether this works. This is only my second one of these, so it's not like we have
Oh,
a long established tradition here. Um,
so I'm not even a guinea pig. I'm
no, you're not even
disappointed.
a guinea pig. You're a billionaire, all right. We know that much. But the guinea pig, we're not certain about. So I'm tailoring this. It was if you're king
Yeah.
or queen for a day, but if you were given the authority to
Uh,
shape, let's say, the next 5 years of aging research or of
uh,
investment or of societal involvement,
uh,
to get the most bang for all those bucks,
uh,
what would you do with that power if granted
yeah.
to you?
Well, it depends on if it's my own self-interest. I would give biology, basic science, a strong foundation for discovery research. If I'm actually I'm a person on the planet and I like people most of the time, I would focus on the clinical area. So here in the US, the ratio of geriatricians to people over 65 is 1 to 7,000. Those are the old numbers. So we don't have enough geriatricians. They're not attracted into the field. And here, of course, in the US, where everything is, healthcare, well, health intervention provision, and the billing records are the medical records, it's a little bit tricky to get into that preventative idea. There are so many things that can be done to improve health in older people, and they're known in the scientific community. They're just not out there on the clinical side. And so things like how to improve physical function, the kind of diet that might be helpful for you, little small tests you can do to keep yourself active and going. So a routine clinic visit, how quickly can this person get off the chair? How quickly can they squeeze this grip thing? These things we know. How fast can they walk down the corridor? Those markers are absolutely bang on in terms of determining somebody's health in older age. There isn't the bandwidth, there isn't the money to implement that as a matter of course, but I think that would be something that would benefit across the board. Then you'd know, okay, let's focus on you now. Let's get you in some rehabilitative care. Okay, we can see now that you're not looking in a favorable spot. Let's make some decisions about how we're going to do things. Things like polypharmacy. So here in the US, anyone over 85 is on at least 15 different medications every day. So, there's the tablet for the thing, and then there's the tablet for the side effect of the thing, and then there's the other thing to balance out what you did with that. And so it can get to the point where the only person who knows what you're on is the guy in the drugstore,
My
the
God.
pharmacist. Yeah. So I think there's opportunity to just take this seriously. And this is something we really ought to be doing. So my more civic minded hat in the short term would invest there. But I think the long-term plus is the basic biology. How do these things fit together? What can we see as the critical tipping point in a system becoming dysregulated? How can we get in there? How can we spot it? And how can we get in there to delay that problem, remediate it completely? So yeah, but obviously I love the science.
We'll see if we can
Am
do.
I dodging because I've given you two answers? It's very
No.
Irish.
Well, listen, we should do both.
Unless I just say I will, yeah.
But you've been made queen or president, whichever you prefer, of the world. So you can definitely get two things done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
both sound amazing, and it's a great place to finish. And it was a real pleasure talking to you, Rozalyn. And we look forward.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you. Yeah, we're going to have a blast.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Thanks so much for your time.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please do subscribe to the channel. You can follow, rate us. You can also add comments so that we can engage in a conversation from here. Stay tuned to all of our social media notifications as we give you more updates about the Longevity Summit Dublin and about the podcast itself. Until next time.